All right. So we've just finished talking about the worst conflict in human history, World War II. So in the first 45 years of the 20th century, we had World War One, World War II. We have tens upon tens of millions of dead soldiers, civilians, victims of war crimes. And in the immediate aftermath of World War II, there's an incredible amount of tension. And this tension is based around the two states that are most responsible for the victory of World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States. While it's true that both of these countries had a common enemy in World War II, the Germans and the Japanese, as soon as the war ends, the differences in goals of these two states are going to put them in direct conflict. And this is going to lead to the next phase of 20th century history. And this is called the Cold War. The Cold War is going to be fought from 1945 to 1991. Now, I have to be careful when I say the Cold War is fought because I don't want to leave you with the wrong idea in your head. The United States and the Soviet Union never actually go to war. The Cold War is an ideological struggle between these two new superpowers most responsible for winning World War II. And what this ideological struggle is based around is the Soviet Union, led by Stalin in the immediacy after World War II, wants to try to spread communism globally. The United States is not interested in allowing that to happen. The USA wants to spread capitalism and liberalization, the democratic ideals that we take so much pride in. And these two ideologies are going to put these two states in direct conflict. And much of the world is going to be associated with one or either of these two sides. And again, I want to emphasize to you as well, there is a true shift in global power. At the start of the 20th century, you had Britain, France, Germany, Japan, Italy, and the United States and Russia as major world powers. By the end of World War II, there are two superpowers, the USA and the Soviets, and everyone else is far in their wake. The American policy towards the Soviets after World War II is going to be an idea called containment. The goal of containment is we're not going to try to drive communism out of places where it's already at. So we're not going to try to make the Soviet Union itself democratic or the regions they took over after World War II democratic. But what we are going to try to do is make sure it does not spread to any new places. That is our key American policy. The American president, Truman, is the author of this policy. Now, one of the things that's going to cause a tremendous amount of tension between these two sides is that by 1952, both sides have nuclear weapons. The United States developed in World War II, but there were Soviet spies embedded in the Manhattan Project. And it's not long after World War II ends that the Soviets are able to successfully detonate a nuclear weapon as well. So, one of the things that causes a tremendous amount of tension in the world during this time period is the idea that if these two sides ever actually go to war with one another, it has the potential to become a nuclear conflict. And not just millions, but tens, hundreds of millions of people could potentially die. Because of that, there are some people who will argue that nuclear weapons is what kept these two sides from ever actually going to war, because either side would be mad to start a nuclear war with the other. There are no winners in a nuclear conflict. This is called mutually assured destruction. Neither side wanted to start a nuclear war because the other side would just launch their nuclear weapons at you, and this would just end in millions and millions of your own people dead. So instead of fighting a direct conflict in the attempt to spread communism, in the case of the Soviets, or to spread liberal ideologies in the case of the United States, you're going to see them fight a different types of wars, and we'll get to what those are in just a little bit. Now, not long after the end of World War II, both sides are going to develop military alliances. NATO, the North Atlantic, and everyone always thinks the A stands for America. It does not. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is an American-led military alliance between the democracies and capitalist states of Western Europe, Canada, and Turkey. There is a Muslim state that is in this alliance. And the goal of this military alliance is containment. Even to this day, NATO is the most important military alliance the United States is a part of, and it's the most powerful military alliance, I would argue, the world has ever seen. The Soviets are going to counter that with the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact is the Soviet-led military alliance. The Soviets are going to force their Eastern European puppet states. Remember, after World War II, the Soviet Union liberates Eastern Europe from Nazi control, and they force those states to become communist. These states are called puppet states because while in name they're free, the Soviets control them. And they force their puppet states that they control after World War II to join the Warsaw Pact. And the goal of the Warsaw Pact is to spread communism. Warsaw Pact countries include East Germany, Poland, and Russia. Now, one of the big ideas I'm going to come back to later on in this class in a couple of videos is what happens to Germany after World War II. All during the Cold War, Germany is divided into two different countries. West Germany, this is the portion of Germany that had been liberated in World War II by the United States and the British, is democratic, and it's going to be capitalist. East Germany was the portion of Germany liberated by the Soviets. It's going to become communist. And these are the Eastern European states that the Soviets are going to liberate after World War II, but they're also going to keep for themselves. Ignore Yugoslavia. There's a unique story about Yugoslavia that I may or may not tell you later on. But again, one of the things that leads to a tremendous amount of tension here is that if any of these states goes to war with the other state, it could potentially lead to World War III, and that World War III could be nuclear. One of the things that was a real problem for the Soviets is that from our military bases and with our allies, American military bases in West Germany, Italy, and Turkey, American fighters can reach the Soviet Union and potentially drop nuclear weapons on them. The Soviets are going to look later on for a way to combat that, and that's going to lead us to one of the most tension-filled portions of the Cold War later. Now, we said the United States and the Soviets never fight directly with one another during the Cold War period. Please do not confuse that with these two countries are at peace with one another. They are not. All over the world, the Soviets are going to try to spread communism, and the United States are going to try to stop it. But they fight these wars indirectly. They fight these wars through their proxies. A proxy war is when I have an enemy and an ally of my enemy is fighting one of my allies. So our allies are at war with one another. And I do everything I can to support my ally. My enemy does everything they can to support their ally. So me and my enemy are not fighting necessarily directly, but we're fighting indirectly through our proxies. You will see Cold War proxy wars fought in Africa. You'll see them fought in Asia. You'll see them fought in Latin America. The most famous proxy wars, and we're going to go into some of these into some depth today, include the Korean War, which is 1950 to 1953. And that was the first big proxy war of the Cold War. The Cuban Revolution, the Vietnam War, which I'm going to talk about much more in a later unit, the Angolan Civil War, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 to 1988. And remember, the cause of each of these proxy wars is the Soviet desire to spread communism and the American desire to contain it. So let's look at some examples of proxy wars. The first major proxy war was in Korea in 1950. After World War II, the Korean peninsula had been divided into two countries, a communist North Korea and an American democratic, well, in name democratic, they were actually a pretty corrupt government at the time, but they weren't communist, South Korea. In 1950, with the backing of Stalin and the Soviet Union, North Korea attacks South Korea, and the goal is to conquer the entire peninsula and to make it one united Korean state that was communist. This was also a Soviet attempt to test the resolve of the United States in 1950. Is the United States really willing to send men to fight and bleed and die in a little corner of Asia that most Americans had never even heard of before, just to keep some East Asians from becoming communist? And it turns out the answer to that question was yes. Truman realizes he needs to send Stalin a message that we're not going to just sit back and let you spread communism wherever you want to. And NATO forces are going to come to South Korea's aid. NATO forces led by the United States. The Korean War was a long war. It fought from 1950 to 1953. Ultimately, NATO is successful in keeping South Korea from becoming communist. Now, some have considered the Korean War only a partial victory for the United States because there was actually a point in the war where it looked like the United States might not just keep South Korea free, but might liberate North Korea as well. NATO forces ultimately failed to do that because of the intervention of China. I'm going to tell you more about the story of communist China becoming a part of the Korean War on another day. But for the time being, you need to know that this is an example of a proxy war. And in this instance, the United States was successful in keeping communism from spreading to a new area. The United States was not so fortunate in the island of Cuba in 1960. A Cuban revolutionary who was communist, Fidel Castro, successfully leads a revolution against an American-backed dictator, Batista. When Castro becomes communist, the United States is not particularly comfortable with this. And the American president at the time is a man named John F. Kennedy, a very famous American president who you've probably heard of. In 1961, the United States oversees really just a disaster. The CIA recruits an army of Cuban refugees, arms them, and trains them. And the goal is that the American Navy is going to drop these Cuban revolutionaries on the island of Cuba, and they're going to fight to overthrow Castro and make Cuba democratic. These soldiers are going to be dropped off in a portion of Cuba called the Bay of Pigs. This is why it's called the Bay of Pigs invasion. Well, the only way that this invasion was ever going to work is if the United States Air Force supplied air cover for them. Kennedy had promised these troops air cover, so these men land on the beaches thinking that the American Air Force is going to be bombing away on their enemies. But at the last second, JFK, for reasons that are still not completely known, decides to cancel the airstrikes. Without the American Air Force's backing, these soldiers are sitting ducks, and Castro and his men are able to either kill or capture all of these invaders, and it became very clear that the United States was behind this attack on the island. In retribution, Castro invites the Soviet Union to build nuclear launch sites on the island of Cuba itself. And this is a very, very, very grave threat to the United States, because if the Soviets are allowed to build a nuclear launch sites with missiles in Cuba, you can see from this map, a large portion of the United States would be susceptible to a nuclear launch. And this gets us to the hottest point of the Cold War, where the closest the world probably ever came to World War III took place. American intelligence tells us that there's a Soviet fleet sailing from Russia heading towards Cuba with nuclear weapons to make these launch sites active. The American President JFK decides this is not something the United States is going to allow. The United States sends the Navy to Cuba and sets up a blockade not to let the Soviet ships through. Every day, the Soviet fleet gets closer and closer to Cuba. The American Navy is around the island, and the whole world is holding its breath, saying to themselves, is World War III about to actually start? At the last moment, through diplomatic channels, the Soviets back down. They back down because Kennedy makes a promise to withdraw nuclear weapons from Turkey and West Germany that the Soviets have been very concerned about. And some of this tension is released. But Cuba is an example of where the United States attempted to keep communism from spreading very close to home, and we fail. Another place where the Cold War blows hot is in the African country of Angola. Angola had, and we're going to get to the freeing of colonies later on in this unit, but Angola had been a colony of Portugal for hundreds of years. They got their independence, and once they got their independence, you almost immediately see in 1975 a civil war between two factions, the communist MPLA and the Democratic UNITA. Two different groups in this new state that have two different visions for what Angola should be. The Soviets and the United States both provide material and financial support to their allies, the Soviets to the MPLA, the USA to the UNITA, and some states actually send soldiers. Cuba sends soldiers to fight in the Angolan Civil War. In South Africa, which is a democracy, sends soldiers to fight with UNITA. So it's a civil war, but there's heavy foreign intervention that's taking place as well. It's long. It's 30 years of fighting and bloodshed and pain. Ultimately, it leads to an MPLA victory, but at a great human cost. 500,000 are killed, 1 million are displaced. And while originally the MPLA had communist leanings, they never really full-scale bring communism to Angola, and that's a whole other long, complicated story that has a lot to do with who wins the Cold War. But we'll get to that story later on in this class. Another example of a proxy war is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviets invade Afghanistan. Afghanistan shared a border with the Soviet Union, and the Soviets are trying to put a pro-Soviet leader into power. Now, if you know anything about Afghanistan, you've paid attention to the news at all the last 20 years, you'll know that Afghanistan is a Muslim state. And when this Muslim state gets attacked by the Soviet Union, Muslim states from all over the world are going to send aid to try to stop the Soviet invasion. We call them Muslim fighters in Afghanistan against the Soviets, the Mujahideen. And the United States is going to send weapons, supplies, military advisors, everything but soldiers to help the Mujahideen fight against the Soviets. Now, one of the things that is somewhat ironic about this is unfortunately later on, some of the fighters in Afghanistan against the Soviets are also going to become prominent members of both the Taliban and Al Qaeda, including Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden cut his teeth fighting the Soviets in the 1980s, and he 100% received aid from the United States in doing this. But the United States backs these Muslim freedom fighters, and ultimately, the Mujahideen are successful and they win, and they drive the Soviets out in 1988. This is going to cause a huge crisis in the Soviet Union that we're going to talk about later on in another class. And it's also going to pave the way for the Taliban to take control of Afghanistan, which is going to lead to a whole other set of issues when we talk about the war on terror in this class later on. And just like these other wars, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is going to come at a terrible human cost. 2 million are dead. There's going to be 1 million refugees that flee to other states. And it's going to pave the way for a lot of the fighting and suffering that people in Afghanistan are dealing with even to this day. So the big takeaway from this lesson is the Cold War is a behind-the-scenes fight for supremacy between the Soviets trying to spread communist ideology and their allies, and the United States trying to contain communism and spread democratic liberalization and capitalism, and our allies. In our next class period, we'll talk about who ultimately wins the Cold War and why. Hint, there's a reason we're not all speaking Russian right now. We're dealing with some really recent history now, 1988. I mean, we're dealing with history that I was alive for. I'm actually old enough to remember the Cold War and some of the tensions that we used to feel in this. So we're talking about stuff now that was just not that long ago. Ask your parents what it was like living in the Cold War, and they'll probably have some memories as well. So I hope you enjoy this. Like I said, we're doing a lot of modern history now, which I'm really excited about, and I will assign you your work.